Hi guys, Sam here. As you probably already know, Josh and I are going to be presenting on Gary Totten's article, Jikalaja and the Problem of Regionalism, Nations, Narratives, and Critical Traditions. So what Totten is really trying to convey with this article is this idea that regionalism as a genre is inadequate for examining indigenous text like Jikalaja's. He points to the disjunction between the dominant critical paradigms and indigenous text as the main problem with this regionalist approach. And more specifically, he highlights the limitations of the genre and its inherent association with nationalistic sentiments that are absent of indigenous voices as the primary reasons that regionalism ultimately fails as a model of analysis for text like Jikalaja's. Throughout the article, Totten seems extremely cognizant of the critical discussion surrounding this topic, and while he does explicitly say that he wishes to criticize the previous scholarship that has looked at Jikalaja through a regionalist lens, he does make an important distinction. He writes that his intention isn't to necessarily disparage the works of other critics, but he thinks that a metacritical approach can alert us to the ways in which the traditional interpretive paradigms and assumptions perpetuate the appropriation of indigenous text. Totten goes on to claim that those who have analyzed Jikalaja as a regionalist writer tend to fall into two general categories. The first being the ones who read her work within the boundaries of regionalism, and then those who look at how her work expands the conception of regionalism and the regionalist canon. But Totten actually separates himself from both approaches, claiming instead that the dissonance between indigenous text and traditional critical categories is ultimately too great, and as a result, they fail to transform the study of American literature.
Hello all, Josh speaking here. Totten writes that Jikalaja does not fit into traditional regionalist analysis because she is writing neither from a fixed ethnicity nor a stable and timeless region. Instead of eulogizing a particular region, culture, or way of life, she interprets identity, geography, and everyday reality through the change occurring from within and outside of her indigenous culture. This ultimately works against the regionalist framework, which seeks to construct a common national identity. Rather, Jikalaja represents a nation embodied, meaning culture and identity are embodied in her person, regardless of her geographic or social location. Totten cites examples found in Jikalaja's stories Impressions and The Trial Path to further illustrate the disjunction between her writings and traditional regionalist interpretation. In Impressions, Jikalaja shows how indigenous life is altered by white culture through a change in use of material resources. Buffalo skin has been exchanged for canvas, and wigwams have been exchanged for the log cabin. Despite these examples of acculturation, Jikalaja's storytelling continues to build on and sustain her indigenous culture. By shifting the narrative verb tense in the trial path from past to present, Jikalaja brings her culture's stories and history into present significance, giving them continued life rather than elegiac memory. A few observations. Jikalaja's work conveys a sense of nostalgia for indigenous life, a significant quality linking her work to the regionalist genre. Her writing does, however, lack the use of dialect and nationalistic sentiment, which is prominent in the genre and its surrounding criticism. Also, Totten's article further explores the way which literary criticism, in addition to literature itself, perpetuates ideologies which we may now find outdated, unjust, or offensive. It's interesting to see how schools of thought are inherited, especially as we consider how and why our authors thought the way that they did. Lastly, the notion of a nation embodied was particularly interesting, especially in light of our increasingly globalized world. In retrospect, this concept also speaks to our other readings, particularly Charles Chesnutt's writings of displaced enslaved people and his use of the trickster storyteller, which activates storytelling as cultural preservation. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hope you all are well, and we'll hopefully get the chance to talk to you all soon. Have a good week.